Hey everybody, Matt Johnson here from Marathon of History and the Durham Legion Branch 308 Military History Museum and Peacekeeping Gallery. And there's sort of a bit of a project on the go today. We're going to have a podcast here that's going to be both for the Marathon of History podcast and which is kind of sort of slowly sharing its time with the Durham Legion Branch 308 Military History Gallery, which makes sense. There's a lot of topics that sort of cover both areas there. So that makes total sense. And we're also going to turn this into a video. So if you'd like to follow along on social media, we're going to have lots of photos and maps and things like that. So make it fun for everybody to watch. So today our guest is John Goheen, who's joining us from British Columbia. And John has been involved in Canadian military history his entire life, both through work with his students when he was a teacher and also through the Royal Canadian Legion, and now through the Legion National Foundation, where he is the guide and historian for their annual Pilgrimage of Remembrance. And that's a program that John's been involved with for a while, spearheading. And John actually last year received the King Charles III Coronation Medal for his involvement with the Legion through his with his community through the Legion, and it's very, very well deserved. So today, John's going to be joining us to talk about something very seasonally topical, and that's the Battle of Vimy Ridge. So, welcome, John.
So Vimy, we're talking about Vimy today.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Vimy Ridge today. I just thought, John, maybe we'd just cover a few things that are interesting, and maybe we would address a few things that are sort of misconceptions, if you will, about Vimy Ridge. There's so many things out there. You hear about Vimy, and a lot of people have heard the name Vimy. They may have read the Pierre Burton book about Vimy. There's so many different knowledge levels. So one thing that always pops up that I've had lots of people tell me very matter of factly, and I want to talk about this one first, is they talk about when you're at the Vimy Memorial, you're at the Vimy Park. People have told me you're standing in Canada.
Yeah.
Can you please address this, John?
No, you're not standing in Canada. There's no passport control. Where that many things around Vimy become mythologized, I think, and that one I've heard at a nickel for every time I'd be very rich. And I know the guides there do get asked about that. They're just like the War Graves Commission as well. The land is ceded in perpetuity. Now with Vimy, that site was given as a gift from France for use by Canada for a memorial, and so that is in perpetuity. That's not going to change, but it's not
Right,
Canadian territory. It is French
right.
soil. And there's no immunity uh, hideout at the Vimy Park to
Right, right, right.
escape French authorities or anything. So no. So,
Okay.
but it is a gift. That's the key thing, is acknowledging that this was a gesture by the French government for Canada's sacrifices. Oh, and which there's 8 battlefield memorials, official battlefield memorials in Europe. Vimy is one of the 8, and all of those have the same status. They were all given as freely for
Okay.
use by Canada, either by the Belgian government or the French.
Okay.
And as some people know, that even Vimy wasn't even the first site selected. They were looking at Hill 62 at one point, for example. But
Okay.
so once the national memorial gets put on the Vimy site, it becomes forever linked as, I guess, in the public perception, as the most important or most significant Canadian battle of the war. Uh,
Right.
it's the first time all 4 Canadian divisions fought together, so that does make sense. It's also the only time all 4 Canadian divisions fought at the same time on the same day.
Right.
Never again did they do that. So, there's some reasons, and that was some of the background to selecting Vimy, with politicians and Kenta King, for that matter, wading in at the time too, is that this was symbolic.
Right.
But it also then fuels, like Tim Cook in his book on Vimy, a fantastic job of looking at the historiography of Vimy as because it was selected as a site, and then what it's become to each generation. And so, more contemporary generations who may not have the same historical level of context of the Great War just assume that Vimy is the most important spot, and
Right.
therefore, and then you hear, birth of a nation. I'm reluctant to use that term, but you hear that asked too, and that came out. That wasn't something that was in 1917. That was on the 50th anniversary when Canada was looking at its centenary in
Okay.
1967, and that quote was from Brigadier Ross, who said, "I was witnessing the birth of the nation." He's looking back right in the, but it's the context of this 100-year Canada. Uh, and so that's an interesting aspect, but to me, it's a disservice because there's a really good, I think, Canadian story that gets forgotten about what Vimy and the development of the Canadian Corps in 1916 and 17, what Vimy, what role that played. And that's something I'd love to talk about today. The Canadians get into Europe in early 1915. Um, by the time Second Ypres is over in April and battles Festubert and Aubers Ridge and Givenchy, Canadians they've suffered, like the First Division is over in Europe. They've suffered about 9,000 casualties, um, huge, huge numbers, and so they're just this single division. And the story of the Canadian Corps is it develops and grows. You get a second division comes over in early 16, third division sometime in the early spring, late winter of 16, and eventually the fourth division comes over. So their Canadian Corps in 1916, they go into the Somme, the first three divisions, first, second, and third, 24,000 casualties in 7 weeks of the fighting in the Somme toward the end. And the fourth division comes in at the tail end as the other three are relieved. But the Canadian Corps is not unified. And this is what I think is the most important part of the Vimy story. It's not a birth of a nation, but it's a birth of the Canadian Corps.
Interesting.
Because what happened is that all four divisions, when they leave the Somme in late November 16, they move to a relatively quieter front up around Arras. And the Canadians are in that area before the northern part of that sector, before the slopes of Vimy. And planning is underway for the spring to have an attack supporting, Battle of Arras, as you talked about in your previous podcast, supporting the French Nivelle's spring offensive. But those four divisions in December 16 are not unified. They're four distinct divisions, all with different identities, different levels of experience. You got the first division that's been there for 2 years. Then you got these newcomers in the fourth division. There's not a lot of connection between the four divisions. And that's something that gets lost, is that the Canadian Corps commander, Julian Byng, sought out to rectify. Now, Byng, Canada owes a lot to Byng. A lot of Canadians think Currie organized Vimy Ridge. Currie was the first division commander and was, again, a favorite of Byng's, and rightly so. He is that good.
Yeah.
But it was Byng that we owe a lot in transforming the Canadian Corps, and the months of training that went in, not just training on the ground. Tactics were changing, using devolving command structure, platoon operating as entities versus companies or even battalions being tried to control from the rear. But Byng would do things like he would have courses, and he would mix officers from the different divisions. They would be connected together. They were sharing information. There was some unification that was beginning to happen, and they had the time to do it. Again, they had 5 months to train for the Vimy operation.
Right.
Um, the training I mentioned itself. tactics were changing, but this is, again, sometimes people think this is a Canadian, these were Canadian innovations. The entire British Expeditionary Force, BF, was looking at tactics and changing. They were all learning from the experience on the Somme and at Verdun from the French. And so tactics were starting to change, and they had to. And you could see that even at the end of the Somme offensive versus the beginning, very different
Right.
infantry tactics. Again, companies trying to control a battle. Well, they'd lose control. Command and control would be lost very quickly. So platoons devolving down to platoon level. This was practiced and rehearsed, but just not a Canadian thing.
Right.
And so, you got that. You've got the artillery preparation, considerably different. You have the innovation of the new fuse, the 106 fuse, that was a contact fuse that could blow up barbed wire on contact. The other thing is, which again the Canadian Corps, I think, could claim, they were some of the best artillery on the Western Front, and it was counter battery work. So if you look at the first day of the Somme, the number of German guns taken out by counter battery work is next to nothing.
Right.
For Vimy, 85% of German guns were taken out before the assault. Wow. And that's to do with sound ranging and flash spotting. And this is the science of warfare. So again, there's a development going on in the entire British Army. There's also development going on within the Canadian Corps of becoming a professional army. And the Canadians are no different from other formations. But what makes the Canadian Corps so different, and that's part of that Vimy story, is that with Byng working with them and developing some unity, the Corps just developed more of a national identity. In a way, it was Canada's field army.
Right.
A Corps is just a shell for any number of divisions can come and go, and the components of a Corps can change. But the Canadian Corps was a unique formation that way, in that it had the 4 divisions, all Canadian, but a lot of British staff officers involved. But it had an identity that was based on a national line, and that made it that added to it. Being recognized that that Canadian element was an important part of the morale of the Canadians, and it wasn't the reason. Like, they weren't Supermen; they didn't take Vimy Ridge because of this, and they formed the nation.
Yeah.
And but it had a component to it, and so there's a lot of things that were going on from the time the Somme started till the time the Vimy operation. And the Canadians were good learners on the battlefield. They were well led. They had exceptional staff officers at the Corps level. The divisional commanders, other than maybe perhaps the 4th Division Commander Watson, were very good.
Right.
And Curry was an elite. Curry stood out amongst all of them. And as you know, he gets promoted to Corps Command in the spring of 1917, not long after Vimy, in June. So there's a whole progression going on there that I think that story is really far beyond the sort of jingoistic and national, patriotic birth of a nation. It's the coming of age of a sort of civilians in uniform into a highly coordinated, well-led, well-trained, and then what was proven at Vimy, highly effective on the battlefield. And again, they weren't Supermen, but as you know, there was the Canadian later on the Canadian 5th Division. They broke those up and beefed them up. But at the time of Vimy, they were still just they were full strength. It wasn't like they're going in, reduced numbers or anything. So the Canadians were good, solid formation. And from Vimy on, they never looked back.
Right.
And while there were nasty campaign or battles in Third Ypres with Second Passchendaele, they still were successful, just at a great cost. But they were they were a different formation than they would have been as component formations, say in middle of 1916 to the middle of 1917. Huge transformation.
Okay.
And yeah, so I think that's the real story
Yeah.
behind Vimy, and one that I wish would be more known. We hear about the Canadian Corps as if it's just this unit that came out of the Somme and then goes to Vimy. They were a corps in name only, and it's those 5 months that, with the intense training and the leadership intentionality of it all, that transformed it from, I think, what would be a civilians in uniform type army to a professional army. And that's what was the war, or the made them effective.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about that too, how that is a far better story and far more impressive than, like you said, the sort of Superman story where Canadian soldiers were so much tougher than everybody else, and all these things you hear. It is more impressive to hear how they did learn as a group and came together. So John, this at the start of the war, was it envisioned to be a corps, or were we just going to supply like divisions that would get scattered throughout the BEF, or when did they sort of decide we would sort of stick together as a national unit?
Well, yeah, that's got its origins with our Minister of Defense, Sir Sam Hughes, who comes from your area, Lindsay, Ontario. I think he's from. Um, Interesting character, and I'm no big fan of Sir Sam, but in a way, we actually do owe the Canadian Corps does owe him a great debt, because his insistence on raising men very quickly, and he did. Uh, he the pre-war mobilization plan, he just scrapped them. You read about Valcarce people being in three different battalions on a single day, and nobody keeping track, and guys showing up at different pay lineups multiple times. All that went on, but it got the first contingent 30,000 over, and his plan was to keep putting divisions in the field and raising more men. He also didn't want them broken up for reinforcements in a way that I'm sure the British would have been much more happy to take battalions and scatter them. But when a country, even though Canada was, not in charge of own foreign affairs, Canada was still contributing greatly to the cause, and that's a significant number. So it added, you couldn't just dismiss the political will from Canada about keeping Canadians in a formation. And so once you start getting multiple divisions over there, it made sense to form a corps, and they kept them that way. There were times in 1918, for example, at Hague, when the Germans launched their spring offensive, the second division actually was removed from the Canadian Corps. Curry objected, and they were used to bolster the British when things were looking pretty bad for a time. But they moved back again to the Canadian Corps, and so it became definitely political will in Canada was to keep the formations together. Now, the other part too is that on a smaller scale, Canada raises 200 and I think to over 240 overseas battalions. These are drafts of men. You think about all your towns and areas in Ontario or BC or wherever, and they send them over. Well, what they didn't always at first realize, they're going to get broken up and put into other Canadian battalions. So there's 48 fighting battalions on the Western Front, but we raise over 200 and I think 260 some odd overseas battalions, and all had their own cap badges and things when they left and went over, but mostly used as reinforcements for the four divisions.
Right. Which is a significant amount of people really to raise for what was a pretty small country at that time. It's pretty impressive when you think of it.
Yeah, you think of the response, and that's why I love the National War Memorial in Ottawa. It's called the the sculpture is called a response. It was significant for a country that had what 9 million people tops, maybe eight something in there.
Hmm.
Uh, they put more than 600,000 are in uniform, and of those, about 420,000 go overseas to the UK. And of those, about 250 some odd thousand serve on the Western Front. And so when you start looking at actually the numbers that served and the casualty totals, which you can look at different sources and see different amounts, but by and large now, the numbers around 64,000 somewhere in there. It's killed. Um, Huge numbers,
Yeah.
given that it's not that percentage is not out of 500,000 plus. That the percentage is out of 250,000, and
Right.
so it shows that the response was huge, but the cost was huge to a very small country.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and
Every
it
small
wasn't like,
town, every small town, every community has a would have been affected.
and that was an issue during the war because volunteer enlistment was drying up by mid-war. Like people, understandably so, people maybe not quite as keen to rush over there. And so manpower obviously became a bit of an issue, and we have conscription. And conscription was in the Second World War highly contentious, First War contentious, but conscription kept the numbers in the Canadian Corps up at the most critical time of the war, in the Canadian 100-Day Campaign, which is to me is the real Canadian story of the Great War. Um, and those numbers were kept. The battalions were kept up to strength because of conscription,
Yeah.
and that gets forgotten too. Um,
S- So when we sort of flash back to Vimy, John, we sort of talked about a few of the misconceptions about it, and another misconception, and you do get this from different sources, is it makes it sound like the French and British assaulted Vimy Ridge continually until the Canadians arrived and finally did it right. Could you just talk a little bit about, the previous attacks on Vimy and previous actions before the Canadians arrived?
yeah, well, it fits into that narrative, like Canadian know-how and brawn, bunch of foresters and miners only could take the ridge, and that fit into even Sam Hughes's percept or bluster about you know professional British staff officers were useless. It takes some fresh eyes, and he always saw the militia as being far superior to professionally trained soldiers. But that's another part of it. But yeah, no, the French, and you hear that all the time in the media that the French and British tried 3 times to take Vimy Ridge and failed, and only the Canadians took it. It sounds great. The French assaulted and largely French. British supported it. They weren't attacking directly at Vimy, but in the French campaigns in 1915 and Artois, uh, most significantly, the French moved the line forward. They had lost the spur that connects perpendicularly to Vimy, more or less, called the Lorette Spur. And now their biggest cemetery, Notre Dame de Lorette, is up on the heights. And from that commanding view, you can see the entire Vimy Ridge. So the French assault in 1915 did move the line forward. Many people that go to Hill 145 and see the Vimy Memorial in the parking lot drive right by and don't notice the Moroccan Memorial. And the Moroccan Memorial is there because in 1915, again, colonial troops and the French army had worked their way up 145. They didn't take it, but they again pushed the line forward. While this is not, and it was costly, and so you talk about the casualty figures, you get, say, the French and British, largely, well, they're French, and the British would be in support campaigns but they were much smaller, and they were not attacking directly at Vimy Ridge. But by moving that line forward, when the Canadians took over the sector in winter of 16 after the Somme, they were closer to the ridge than they would have been had they taken over the line before the French operations.
Right.
And so that line through for the Canadians' arrival was British held. The British held the line in 16 as a quieter sector, and there's a lot of mining warfare going on. Hence the big craters you see there, not from the Vimy battle, but from 16, Broadmarsh crater, Grange crater, hundreds of craters as their mining warfare is going on. So the British held the line, but they weren't assaulting Vimy Ridge at that time. They were
Right.
just it was holding their chunk partly up the ridge. So it's the French that largely try to take the heights of Vimy in 1915. But the Canadian operation is tactically brilliant. They combining new tactics, combining great counter battery work to knock out the German artillery, and the forgotten heroes of that is the Royal Flying Corps, who were up every day observing and doing the work to find out where these guns are from the flash spotting, and suffered terrible casualties to get that information. Um, but tactical success. But once they took the ridge, there was no means to exploit it. And you hear that, you can read that in the accounts, or they get to the heights and can see the Douai plain, lush and green, all in behind, and the Germans simply just going back,
Yeah.
but no way to push it any further. So it's a limited tactical victory. It takes the heights, but had they not taken Vimy, would the outcome of the war have been different? Probably not.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, in terms of its importance, you can argue militarily, it I think Vimy's importance is that it was a culmination of the Canadians' training to take that height. It was deemed necessary to support the French offensive, but
Yeah.
a very limited victory in a way. Nothing like in 1918, where they're breaking through the DQ line and moving on the Canal of Nord, and all those battles that break the German army.
Right.
And and it gets forgotten too. This in the Somme, the Vimy Memorial has the names of 11,000 plus missing in France. 40% of those are from the Somme. 39%, I think it is, and that gets forgotten. And yet, you could argue, well, the Somme was a terrible attritional battle. It was awful. It just about wore down the German army. And you think about the German army going through these series of battles, the Verdun with the French, Somme, they lose another 400,000. Then they get into the Battle of Arras, and then they go to Passchendaele. They can't keep sustaining these losses. So they all fit in its place in grinding and wearing down the German army. But I think the rather than the ridge being taken, the success of Vimy is that the Canadian Corps established itself as an elite fighting formation that gets then used to spearhead. And there's much written about this being the shock of, now the British Empire in 1918, and it's true. The punch value of the Canadian Corps was incredible. They were overstrength, well led, effective soldiers. Australians too, except they couldn't maintain the manpower. They didn't have
Right.
conscription. So, but the Australians had that same regard for the last 2 years of the war until they couldn't keep up the numbers.
Right, right. So when we sort of talk about Vimy Ridge, sort of flashing back to the German side of Vimy, what then there certainly must have been mistakes made by the Germans. Like what could they have done a little differently per se?
Well, you got to then nothing's static in the Great War, and that's the thing. You've got both sides are changing and evolving, and somehow the Germans had a head start, so they were gearing for war. It took the British some time to catch up, but the Germans were changing doctrinally as well in 1917. So the defense, the defense in that they had lines of 3 lines of defense was starting to change to more of a defense in depth, where instead of static lines of trenches that you would hold, it was more of a well, you see it at Passchendaele, it's kind of a checkerboard type defense where you've got supporting fields of fire, not so much from trench lines, but from positions. And so they were changing that. Now, nothing changes because somebody officer at high command gives an order. And so at Vimy, you've got officers who may not have agreed or were completely comfortable with the changing types of defense doctrine. And so that factors into the battle, depending on where along that 10-kilometer front. The other part, though, about Vimy is also just the topography and terrain. So the high ground, Hill 145 and the Pimple, is also very narrow. You can't defend that in depth.
Right.
And so you kind of have a line. But once that line is broken, if you can crack through it, you're done. And
Right. Right.
so essentially, that's what happened was on the high ground. If you go down to the further south, where the First Division Curry, that's pretty much flat. It is a ridge, but you have a hard time figuring out that it looks like a ridge. It's just sloping terrain, very gradual, and they advance three kilometers. And so the German defense in depth, by simply Canadians enveloping positions and moving forward, were able to crack that. I'm not going to say easily, but quite effectively.
Yeah.
And so, could the Germans done anything differently? I don't know what. I don't know what. Maybe the position itself was not all that tenable, given what they were up against. Like overwhelming firepower that the
Yeah.
British brought to bear in the Canadian sector was insane. Even at the innovations like the machine guns, the MGs, they were using those as light artillery. They simply had machine guns elevated, pouring lead into the German lines for days, just repeatedly, nonstop, just all day.
Yeah.
If you were a German trying to defend that, short of having, you know, tens of thousands of soldiers, I guess, and artillery, but they didn't have that. I'm not sure what the Germans could have done all that differently at Vimy. I think, given the tactics, the ability to punch, the strength of the Canadian divisions at the time, and the overwhelming firepower and the counter battery work, which I think is probably the biggest key to the whole success. German
Right.
artillery is simply neutralized. How would you combat that?
Yeah. And of course, that counter battery fire, as you talked about, that was a direct lesson from the Somme, right? Like get rid of those guns.
Yeah, German artillery. Chile is the master of the battlefield, so you got to neutralize German guns, and they had the science now to do it. It wasn't just like, well, we think it's over there.
Right.
With the flash spotting, so using with aircraft, they could determine. I don't know the science behind it. It always confuses me. But the
Yeah.
flash of a German gun, they could calculate, triangulate where the gun was, and same with the sound. They could tell, and within meters, really, they could pinpoint where this was. That technology didn't exist
Yeah. Yeah.
first day of the Somme. And what gets forgotten the first day of the Somme is we're going to use more firepower than anyone has ever seen, unprecedented amounts. That was Haig's plan. He didn't want, he was kind of rushed into the offensive because of what was going on in Verdun for the French. So the way that you could neutralize the Germans was to put more firepower in a concentrated area than anyone's ever seen. The theory being, how could you withstand that? Well, they did. They were underground and withstood lots of it. I
Yeah.
wouldn't want to be on the receiving end, and lots of them got killed, but not enough of them. They realized that had to change. And how you could blame Haig or anyone for not knowing that, I think, is just nothing but revision or looking back type history is the fact at the time that was the best doctrine they could come up with to
Yeah.
it was trying to break the mystery of the defense on the Western Front. That's why you've got sideshows and anything but
Right.
bashing against head-on positions. But you know what? They learned how to do it. And Vimy is the first sign where you see in a larger scale where it started to work.
Right.
And again, tactics, artillery, technology, culmination of all these things coming together. And
We talk about Vimy with that type of thing. How much did the Canadians benefit from just the British, I guess you'd say logistics, the engineers, the British logistical trains, the artillery? It must have been substantial at Vimy.
yeah, because the Vimy, the Canadian Corps is supported again. They're in the First Army under General Horn, and so it's not just Canadian artillery, but it's the first Army's artillery as well. So being able to bring to bear a massive amount of firepower. The Canadian right flank, the First Division right flank, that's British units as well, and just within the Canadian Corps, the makeup of the staff, the core staff, is largely professional British soldiers that have been with Bing all along, developing this teamwork, and so is by no means all Canadian. Even the composition of the Canadian soldiers, like that's forgotten too. And people today, I don't know if they understand like how do people see themselves as being Canadian. Most of the Canadian Corps, still in 1917, was not Canadian born. It's only actually the very last month of the war in 1918, in November, that it tips the scale, and 51% of the Canadian Corps composition is born in Canada. Most Canadian Corps, while they're not Canadian born, the ones that are not Canadian born are British born. Brits and Scottish, English, Irish.
Yeah.
You've got some Europeans and things in there, but the vast majority are British born. So the identity thing, a lot of after the fact stuff, like they were seeing themselves as Canadian and they're proud to be in the Canadian Corps. But there wasn't this need to separate so much in the way that we do today as on a national line. Like you had a British passport, you're British and Canadian. It wasn't in opposition to each other anyway.
Right.
It was just that was your identity. You're in the British Army. You're in the British Army, and to say that somehow Canadians are an autonomous um, force is ridiculous. They're part of the British Expeditionary Force. But Vimy did develop. I wouldn't. It's not like this birth of the nation so much, but I would say it developed just like a winning hockey team. People get cocky, and they developed an identity. They knew they were good, um, and that carried with them, I think, to the end of the war.
Right.
There was a bit of cockiness there, and based on the goods, like they delivered the goods, and so being associated with that was a mark of pride. But whether you're born in Liverpool or Ottawa, but they weren't going to great lengths to separate themselves. But there was a lot of British nationality, British officers within the Canadian Corps working with a divisional level in the division headquarters and also at the corps level.
That's interesting, though, how you talk about that, how it's more looking back that we put that big separation on between us and everybody, really, when at the time it was not maybe not as great of a deal. So, John, you've been doing this a long time, and you've been to Vimy a lot. If somebody's going to Vimy sort of for the first time, this spring or this year, what would you say they should look for? What are some must sees you would say at Vimy?
Every time I've taken groups to Vimy and the people seeing it for the first time, there is an audible gasp as you go up the road from the visitor center and they see it. So, definitely it's got just that monument alone. People think about it. They've wanted to go there. used to be on our $20 bill and inside our passport. Like it's so iconic. And so people want to see that. And rightly so. It's an impressive, it's breathtaking. The trouble is, I think, is that too often that becomes the sole beginning and end of the Vimy tour. Like you're going to Hill 145, whereas you got 10 kilometers of battlefield. So outside of the Vimy area, which is all worth seeing, the monument and spend time, and the tunnel tour is worth going down if you've never been there. Even the preserved trenches give you a sense of how close in mining warfare frontline trenches could be. The fact that it was visited during the Second War by Hitler and the Germans, a great tourist area, that's interesting too. The development of that whole park and the amount of time and the Allward's vision for that monument. Those are all great stories worth taking time. But it's outside of the park. I don't mean park like it is Vinny Park.
Yeah.
But outside of the boundaries, there's still a battle to go look at. And so for every visitor standing at Hill 145, I wonder what the ratio, how many thousands of visitors go to the park and how few will go down to the first division area, for example, and see all it is fields, a bit bisected by the highway now, unfortunately.
Right.
But there's areas down there that you could actually see the scale of the Vimy battle. And so when I take groups, you could spend a week there. But what I try to do is to show them beyond the Hill 145. And so I go to Notre Dame de Lorette, and there's a great memorial up there in a French cemetery. It's got, 20,000 crosses and 20,000 sets of bones in an ossuary. It's very French, but it also gives you a vantage point to see the entire ridge.
Right.
And so it gives you a sense of scale, and it's a huge operation. And I think it gets lost when you're standing on a monument and then there's all the trees are planted. You can't conceive the scale of the Vimy operation without understanding the scale. I don't know how you can understand Vimy. So what I recommend if people go is you don't just do if all you got is a morning, then you go to the memorial park, but
yeah,
is to spend a few days at least and tour around outside of the area. Some of the cemeteries are just in behind or just in front of what was the Canadian front line. But of the day of the battle, the first day of the battle, they're right in the line of advance, and there's spots you can see. If you get into the woods now, they're largely taking over and nature's reclaiming. But the third division area is in a wooded area now, by and large. But you can still go in there. There's trails, and you can see remnants of German trench lines and shell craters, and again, hard to kind of conceive with all the trees, but you can see that something was going on in there. And that to me, I think, is the important part. Is this the you can read about the numbers and things about Vimy, but to get a sense of the scale and to see it,
Right.
you got to travel around and walk the ground, and that's the essence of any good battlefield touring, is walking the ground as much as you can. The Vimy battle for the four divisions was a very different battle. The first division's Vimy was very different from the fourth. Different
Right.
terrain, different obstacles. First division was largely successful. The fourth was nearly disastrous. And so to go check that out and see why, you see how the train contributed so much. That's how you understand, if that's your intention, is to understand the battle, is to go
Yeah.
see the sites. And so that's my recommendation for everybody to go. So definitely go see where 99% of the people go, but also get off the beaten track a bit.
So on that topic, John, what's coming up for you? You have some trips over to Europe this year, I understand.
Yeah, well, so yeah, about a week from now, I'll be over in Northwest Europe again, and then I get back, and that gets back in early May, and then I do another one in late May, um, and then another one in the fall.
Okay. So you're racking up the air miles then back and forth from BC. How far a flight is that
Oh
from BC to
Lord.
Paris?
Uh, what is it? How many thousand, 8,000 kilometers? I don't know. About a 9.5 hour flight direct.
Okay, that's
It's long enough.
that's long enough for sure. Well, there it is. That was a lot of fun chatting Vimy Ridge with John Goheen, and as you can see, he's a absolute wealth of knowledge. And if you do get a chance to ever go with John to the Vimy area or to any of the battlefields of Northwest Europe, whether that's through Liberation tours or through the Legion trips that we talked about, it'll be well worth your while. So if you want to check out a little bit more about visiting Vimy Ridge, of course, you can check out the Government of Canada's official Vimy Ridge Heritage Park. Forget what exactly words I should be using there, but the Vimy Ridge Battlefield Park website. And if you want to look at something more along the line of a group tour, you can check out Liberation Tours, which is at liberationtours.ca, which is a company John works for. So they have, I believe, a trip coming up next year to Vimy Ridge, as well as Vimy's a scheduled visit for their regular Northwest Europe Battlefield Tour. So check that out if you're interested in visiting Vimy Ridge. And as always, I appreciate you listening to the Marathon of History podcast, and visit marathonofhistory.ca for more information about Marathon of History, my business, the Heritage Toy Series, and all those good things. So thank you very much, and we'll talk to you again.